Imagine waking up one morning and realizing your name is on a list. Not a guest list, not a record list, a list that moves in the night, carried by men in long coats who knock on doors and never announce themselves. Thousands of people across the Soviet Union experienced exactly that. Professors, generals, poets, factory workers, old Bolsheviks who had bled for the revolution, all of them gone, erased, not just from life, but from photographs, from history books, from the memories the state allowed people to keep. And at the center of it all, one man who never raised his voice in public, who smiled for cameras with a pipe in hand and children on his lap, who was called in official speeches the father of nations, but no father in history has orphaned as many children. His name was Joseph Stalin. And this is not just a story about power. It is a story about what power does to a human being and what a human being, given enough power, can do to the world. On December 18, 1878, in a small Georgian town called Gori, a boy was born into a world that had very little patience for boys like him. His mother, Keki, was a devout, hard-working laundress who prayed with the intensity of someone bargaining with God. His father, Beso, was a drunk, an occasional brute, and eventually a man who simply stopped coming home. The boy's early life was marked by pain in nearly every direction. At age 7, he contracted smallpox, and the disease left his face permanently scarred. A childhood carriage accident damaged his left arm. It would never fully extend again. He was small, he was poor, and in the hierarchy of a small Georgian town, he was nobody. But there is something particular that happens to certain people when the world tells them they are nothing. Some accept it, some collapse under it, and some, a rare few, decide very quietly that they will make the world pay for saying it. His mother managed to enroll him in the Gori Church School and then, remarkably, in the Tiflis Theological Seminary, one of the best educational institutions in the Caucasus. She wanted a priest, a safe, respectable life for her damaged, brilliant boy. What she got was something else entirely. Because inside that seminary, surrounded by the rigid discipline of the Russian Orthodox Church, the young man who would become Stalin discovered something that would rewrite his entire sense of the world: revolutionary literature. Dostoevsky, Victor Hugo, and then Karl Marx. Marx's argument was almost musical in its simplicity. History was a story of class struggle. The powerful exploited the powerless, and the only path to justice was to tear the system down and rebuild it from nothing. For a boy who had grown up at the bottom of everything, poor, scarred, fatherless, Georgian in a Russian empire that looked down on Georgians, this was not just politics, this was personal. He was expelled from the seminary in 1999. The official reason, failure to attend exams. The real reason was far dangerous. He had become a revolutionary organizer, reading banned texts and whispering ideas that carried prison sentences. Over the next decade, he threw himself into the underground. He organized strikes. He robbed banks to fund the Bolshevik Party. Stalin himself led the famous 1907 Tiflis bank robbery that killed 40 people and netted the equivalent of millions of dollars. He was arrested 7 times, exiled to Siberia 6 times, and escaped 6 times. The man who would one day exile millions learned exile himself over and over again. And each time he came back harder. He adopted a new name during these years. No longer Ioseb Jugashvili, the smallpox-scarred boy from Gori. From now on, he would be Stalin, Man of Steel. When the Russian Revolution exploded in 1917, the men who took power were, by any measure, extraordinary. Lenin, the ideological architect; Trotsky, the brilliant military commander, the man who built the Red Army from scratch; Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, writers, theorists, orators, who could hold a crowd for hours with nothing but ideas. And then was Stalin. He was not the best speaker. He was not the most original thinker. Lenin privately found him crude and difficult. Trotsky barely acknowledged him as an intellectual equal. But Stalin understood something none of them fully did. In a revolution, it is not the loudest voice that wins. It is the person who controls the paperwork. Lenin appointed him General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922, a largely administrative role that no one coveted. It sounded like a desk job. It was, in fact, the key to the entire apparatus. As General Secretary, Stalin quietly controlled who got appointed to what position, who received promotions, who was assigned to far-flung postings in distant provinces. Over months and years, he filled the party structure with people loyal to him, not to Lenin, not to Trotsky, not to any ideology, to him. Lenin saw the danger too late. In his final letters, what historians call Lenin's testament, he explicitly warned the party about Stalin. He wrote that Stalin had accumulated enormous power and could not be trusted to use it wisely. He recommended Stalin be removed from his role. Lenin died in January 1924, before those words could change anything. Stalin made sure the testament was suppressed. He aligned himself first with Zinoviev and Kamenev to isolate Trotsky, then turned on Zinoviev and Kamenev, then allied with Bukharin against them, then purged Bukharin. Each move was timed perfectly. Each alliance was temporary. Each betrayal came exactly when his former ally was most vulnerable. By 1929, 12 years after the revolution, every major rival was either in exile, in prison, or dead. And Joseph Stalin, the unremarkable administrator, the man Trotsky had once dismissed, was the undisputed ruler of the Soviet Union. He had not seized power in a single dramatic coup. He had assembled it, piece by piece, the way a man builds a wall, one brick at a time, until you suddenly realize you're surrounded. Stalin looked at the Soviet Union in 1929 and saw a country that had fallen behind the world by a century. The West was industrialized, Russia was not, and Stalin believed, with the certainty of a man who had never doubted himself, that unless the Soviet Union industrialized fast, it would be destroyed. He was, in a brutal sense, not wrong about the threat. What he was wrong about was the price he was willing to make other people pay for it. He launched the 5-year plans, an unprecedented attempt to drag an agricultural nation into industrial modernity in less than a decade. Factories were built, steel mills, dams, railroads. By 1940, Soviet industrial output had grown by a factor that genuinely impressed Western economists. This was real. It happened. But to feed the factories, Stalin needed to collectivize agriculture, to take millions of privately held farms and merge them into state-controlled collectives. The peasants who owned those farms had other ideas, and Stalin had a simple policy for people who had other ideas. He labeled resisting peasants kulaks, wealthy farmers, enemies of the state, saboteurs of the revolution. The label was almost meaningless. It applied to anyone who objected. Millions of families were deported to Siberia. Their grain was seized. Their livestock was slaughtered rather than surrendered. In Ukraine, the result was catastrophe. The Holodomor, a man-made famine, killed between 3.5 and 7 million people between 1932 and 1933. Historians continue to debate whether it should be classified as genocide. What is not debated is what happened. Entire villages emptied. Children died in the streets. People ate bark, leather, things that cannot be written here. And the Soviet government knew. Officials were reporting the death toll upward to Moscow. Stalin responded by increasing grain quotas. Then came the Great Purge. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin turned his terror inward against the party itself. Show trials were staged, elaborate Soviet theater in which old Bolsheviks confessed, on camera, to crimes they had not committed: sabotage, espionage, treason against the revolution. The confessions were obtained through weeks of sleep deprivation, threats against family members, and pure psychological demolition. Then the defendants were shot anyway. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, ran quotas for arrests and executions. Regional officials were given targets: arrest this many enemies, execute this many saboteurs. If they failed to meet the numbers, they became the next entry on the list. An estimated 750,000 people were executed during the purge. Millions more entered the Gulag, a vast network of labor camps stretched across the Soviet Arctic, where prisoners built canals, felled timber, and died of cold and exhaustion in numbers that are still being counted. Fear was no longer just a tool. It had become the architecture of the state itself. Everyone was watched. No one was safe. The only thing protecting you from accusation was the fact that you had not yet been accused. And somehow, this was the genius and the horror of it. The system kept running. People showed up for work. They applauded at party meetings. They named their children after Stalin, because the alternative was unthinkable. In August 1939, Stalin signed something that shocked the world: the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement with Adolf Hitler. The two greatest totalitarian powers of the century, ideologically sworn enemies, had agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Stalin believed he had bought time. He used those 2 years to expand Soviet territory westward into Poland, the Baltic states, Finland. He felt, perhaps, that he had outmaneuvered Hitler the same way he had outmaneuvered everyone else. He was wrong. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory on a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. Stalin, by all accounts, collapsed. He had received dozens of intelligence warnings that the invasion was coming. British intelligence, Soviet spies, his own military officers, all told him Hitler was preparing to strike. Stalin dismissed them all. He refused to believe it. And when it happened, he retreated to his dacha outside Moscow and did not emerge for nearly 2 weeks. The man who had remade an entire civilization through sheer force of will simply froze. The early months were catastrophic. Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in their hundreds of thousands. By October 1941, German forces were within sight of Moscow. An estimated 3 million Soviet soldiers had been taken prisoner, and most of them would die in German camps. But then, something remarkable happened. Stalin re-emerged. Whether from shame, necessity, or the cold calculation that soldiers had been taken prisoner, and most of them would die in German camps. But then, something remarkable happened. Stalin re-emerged. Whether from shame, necessity, or the cold calculation that surrender was impossible, he returned, and he became a wartime leader of genuine, terrible effectiveness. He gave the famous November 7th speech from Red Square, with German forces 40 miles away, invoking not Marx or Lenin, but the Russian heroes of centuries past, Alexander Nevsky, Kutuzov, Suvorov. He reframed the war not as a defense of communism, but as a defense of the motherland itself. It worked. Somehow, it worked. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, became the turning point of the entire war. 2 million combatants fought in the ruins of a single city for 6 months. The Soviets encircled and destroyed an entire German army. General Paulus surrendered 300,000 men. From Stalingrad, the Red Army never stopped moving west, through Ukraine, through Poland, through the heart of Germany itself. On May 2, 1945, Soviet soldiers raised a red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. The Soviet Union had lost between 26 and 27 million people in the war. No other nation suffered anything close to that scale. And Stalin, the man who had helped cause catastrophic early defeats through his purges of the military leadership, through his refusal to believe his own intelligence, emerged from it all as a hero. The optics of history are strange and ruthless things. Victory did not soften Stalin, it confirmed him. In the years after 1945, he expanded Soviet influence across Eastern Europe, installing loyal communist governments from Warsaw to Budapest to Prague. The Cold War was no longer a metaphor, it was a new permanent condition of the world. And to believe he was preparing another Great Purge, another generation of loyal communists about to be consumed by the machine they had helped build. Then, on March 1, 1953, guards found Joseph Stalin collapsed on the floor of his private dining room at the Kuntsevo dacha. He had suffered a massive stroke. For 4 days, his inner circle, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, hovered around him, doing essentially nothing. Some historians suggest they deliberately delayed calling physicians. Others believe they were simply terrified to make a decision without his approval, even as he lay dying. He died on March 5, 1953. He was 74 years old. The man who had made millions disappear into the night simply stopped breathing, alone, on the floor, with no one willing to touch him. Historians will argue about his legacy until the language changes. But the question his life poses to all of us is not about Stalin at all. It is about the systems that make a Stalin possible. The chaos and desperation that clears the path for someone willing to promise order at any price. The ordinary people who one by one chose to look away because looking was too dangerous. Dictators are rarely born. They are made by the rest of us, and that is why we keep telling this story.